The lights are already on when the door unlocks. Not all of them, just enough to make the mirrors usable and the floor visible without feeling awake yet. Rubber mats hold on to the night's cold, and the air carries that familiar mix of disinfectant and old iron. Somewhere in the room, a clock clicks forward, not loudly, just enough to be noticed when everything else is quiet. This is how most mornings begin, not with intention announced out loud, but with a routine already moving. There is a habit to the first walk through the space. Eyes move ahead of thought. You notice which machines were wiped down carefully and which ones were rushed. You register the corner where someone always stretches too long, blocking the flow, and the spot near the front desk where people slow down, hesitating before committing to a conversation. None of it feels strategic while it's happening. It feels like maintenance. Like keeping something alive long enough to understand what it needs next. Most gym owners arrive like this. They come early, stay late, and carry the place with them even after they leave. They know every sound the building makes. They know which treadmills squeak and which doors stick when the humidity changes. They also know, quietly, that effort alone has not solved the problem. The classes are full enough to look busy, but not full enough to feel safe. The rent clears, but only after a few anxious days. There is motion everywhere, yet progress feels strangely still. The first client of the day arrives while you're adjusting a bench. She smiles, nods, and heads toward the lockers without stopping. There's comfort in that familiarity. At the same time, there's a small tension beneath it. Comfort doesn't pay invoices. Familiarity doesn't scale. You watch her walk away and realize that most of the work you're doing is invisible to the people who would need to understand it the most. The gym industry teaches lessons without announcing them. It rewards intensity, but it doesn't reward chaos. It praises passion, but it punishes vagueness. Many owners learn this slowly, through exhaustion rather than insight. They add more classes when revenue drops. They lower prices when leads slow down. They post more when attendance dips, hoping visibility will turn into certainty. What often goes unnoticed is how scattered the effort becomes. Promotions change every month. Messaging shifts depending on who's tired that week. The business starts reacting instead of deciding. From the outside, it still looks like ambition. From the inside, it feels like chasing something that keeps drifting just out of reach. It usually starts with a belief that never gets said out loud. If I just work harder, this will work. That belief fuels long days and short nights. It also hides something quieter. Hard work is not the same as directed work. Energy without structure leaks. Attention without a clear offer diffuses. The gym stays open, but the business doesn't actually move forward. At some point, often while sitting at the front desk between classes, there's a pause. It isn't dramatic. It feels more like noticing the same conversations repeating. Prospects ask the same questions. Staff give the same explanations. Sales feel awkward, like interruptions rather than a process. You begin to sense that the problem isn't demand. It's clarity. Clarity starts with understanding what people are really buying. They aren't buying access to equipment. They aren't buying square footage or schedules. They're buying a result they haven't been able to create on their own. They're buying certainty during a moment when confidence is fragile. They're buying relief from decision fatigue, even if they'd never describe it that way. Once that realization settles, the gym looks different. Mirrors stop being about form and start being about identity. The front desk stops being a checkpoint and becomes a threshold. The pricing board is no longer just numbers. It's a signal of seriousness, expectation, commitment. Every detail is communicating something, whether you intend it to or not. Most gyms never design that communication deliberately. They inherit it. They copy competitors. They repeat what feels familiar. Over time, sameness sets in, and sameness creates price sensitivity. When everything feels interchangeable, the cheapest option wins, and the cheapest option rarely lasts. The shift begins when you stop asking how to get more people inside and start asking how to make a single decision feel obvious. This isn't about pressure. It's about removing friction. It's about presenting one clear path instead of 5 confusing ones. People don't resist buying. They resist uncertainty. You see this clearly in consultations. When someone hesitates, it's rarely because they don't want the outcome. It's because they don't trust the process yet. They've tried before. They've stopped before. They're protecting themselves from another attempt that fades after a few weeks. A well-designed launch doesn't argue with that fear. It anticipates it. It structures the experience so commitment feels supported instead of risky. Scarcity isn't manufactured tension. It's alignment between attention, capacity, and timing. When it's done well, it doesn't pressure. It focuses. As the morning fills, music rises and conversations overlap. From the outside, it looks like an ordinary day. From the inside, something has shifted. There's a growing awareness that the business isn't a collection of scattered efforts. It's a system waiting to be organized. The realization is subtle but persistent. Growth isn't hidden in motivation. It's hidden in sequence. It isn't about doing more things. It's about doing the right things in the right order, long enough for them to matter. When the rush ends, the floor is scattered with bottles and towels. The air is warmer now. Heavier. You finally sit down, not because the work is done, but because you're starting to see it differently. The gym is no longer just a place you run. It's a message you're sending, whether you mean to or not. And once you notice that, it becomes impossible to ignore. The afternoon slows the room down. Fans hum instead of roar, and the music settles into something steady enough to disappear into the background. A few members linger longer than they need to, stretching conversations the way they stretch muscles, reluctant to leave the structure behind. You watch them go, one by one, until the quiet returns in layers rather than all at once. This is usually when the numbers surface. Not the dramatic ones, not projections or annual goals, but the small counts that repeat every day. How many leads came in? How many appointments were set? How many showed up? How many said yes? How many said they would think about it? These numbers don't shout. They whisper. Over time, they tell the truth more reliably than enthusiasm ever could. Most gyms never look at them closely. They sense performance instead of measuring it. They remember the good days and excuse the slow ones. The business becomes a story told from emotion rather than evidence. It feels busy, so it must be working. It feels hard, so it must be valuable. When you finally sit with the data, even if it's scribbled in a notebook or trapped in a half-used spreadsheet, something uncomfortable happens. The gap becomes visible. You see exactly where interest fades. You see how often curiosity dies between the first message and the first visit. You see how many conversations end without a decision, not because people said no, but because nothing guided them toward yes. The instinct is to fix everything at once. New ads. New scripts. New offers. New branding. This scattershot urgency feels productive, but it rarely is. Systems don't respond well to panic. They respond to focus. The more effective move is quieter. You choose one point in the process and stay there long enough to understand it. Often, that point is the initial offer. Not the discount, not the headline, but the promise beneath it. What exactly changes for the person who says yes, and how certain does that change feel? Certainty is built through structure. A defined start. A defined end. Clear expectations around effort and outcome. When people know what the next step looks like, they stop imagining worst-case scenarios. When they know how progress will be measured, they stop doubting whether effort will matter. This is why vague memberships struggle. Unlimited access sounds generous, but it hides responsibility. It leaves success undefined. A structured program does the opposite. It says, this is the path, this is the pace, and this is what happens if you follow it. The clarity itself becomes part of the value. You notice this when presenting options. When there are too many, people stall. They ask questions that circle instead of landing. When there's one primary path, questions sharpen. They become practical rather than defensive. How does this fit my schedule? What happens if I miss a week? What do I do when motivation drops? These are buying questions, not objections. They appear when someone is already imagining themselves inside the process. The role of the gym shifts here. It stops being a place that convinces and becomes a place that confirms. Pricing plays its role quietly. Too low, and it signals doubt. Too complicated, and it signals confusion. A clear price tied to a clear outcome transfers confidence. It tells the prospect that this has been thought through, repeated, refined. That others have walked this path and arrived somewhere specific. As days pass, focus tightens. You stop trying to please everyone. You stop softening the message to avoid discomfort. Instead, you let the structure filter. Some people opt out early, and that becomes a relief rather than a loss. The ones who stay lean forward instead of hesitating. The gym begins to feel different during consultations. Conversations shorten, not because they're rushed, but because they're aligned. Silence appears, not as awkwardness, but as consideration. Decisions happen in the room instead of drifting into follow-up messages that fade into nothing. Behind the scenes, operations simplify. Staff know what to explain and what not to. Onboarding becomes repeatable. Progress tracking becomes visible. Success stories stop sounding accidental and start sounding familiar. Late one evening, after the last member leaves and the lights dim again, you walk the floor the same way you did that morning. The space hasn't changed. The equipment is the same. The walls hold the same marks and scuffs. What has changed is the intention behind it all. The gym is no longer trying to be everything. It's trying to do one thing well, again and again, with enough precision that results stop feeling surprising. That repetition builds trust. Trust builds momentum. Momentum, once it starts, has a way of carrying everything else with it. For the first time in a while, the numbers you write down at the end of the day feel less like guesses and more like signals you know how to answer. Morning returns without ceremony. The lock turns. The lights come up halfway. The room wakes in stages. What feels different now isn't the space itself, but the way attention moves through it. You no longer drift from task to task. There's an order, even when it isn't written down. Conversations begin with intention instead of improvisation. Each interaction carries a direction, even when it stays relaxed. The front desk becomes the center of gravity. Not because it's impressive, but because it's where uncertainty either dissolves or deepens. A new lead walks in, eyes moving quickly, absorbing cues faster than words could ever explain. They notice how they're greeted. They notice whether answers come easily or cautiously. They notice whether the room feels owned or merely occupied. You stop trying to impress them with everything at once. There's no tour that stretches too long, no explanation of every machine. Instead, there's a rhythm. You ask a few questions and actually wait for the answers. You listen long enough to hear patterns instead of collecting facts. People rarely say what matters most in the first sentence. It comes out sideways, through frustration, through humor, through the way they describe what didn't work before. When the offer is presented, it lands differently. It isn't framed as an opportunity they might miss, but as a process they can step into. The start date is clear. The structure is clear. The expectation of effort is stated without apology. There's relief in that honesty. It removes the silent negotiation most people are already tired of having. The days that follow reveal something important. The people who join show up differently. They arrive earlier. They ask better questions. They take notes without being prompted. This isn't because they're better people. It's because the container is stronger. The environment tells them how to behave before anyone needs to correct them. Retention stops feeling mysterious. When someone leaves, there's usually a reason, and it's often visible weeks earlier. Attendance softens. Engagement thins. Progress slows. Instead of reacting at cancellation, the system notices sooner and responds sooner. A conversation happens before disappointment hardens into withdrawal. Marketing shifts tone as well. Instead of reaching for everyone scrolling past, it speaks directly to the few who are ready. The language becomes specific. The outcome is described plainly. There's no promise of transformation without effort. Some people disengage immediately, and that becomes an advantage rather than a problem. Leads arrive warmer. They ask fewer surface-level questions. They reference details from what they saw. They've already started opting in before you ever meet them. Sales conversations shorten again, not because anything is rushed, but because alignment has already begun upstream. Behind all of this sits a simple discipline that's harder than it looks. Consistency. Not in motivation, but in execution. The same process is followed on slow days and busy ones alike. Especially on slow days. The temptation to improvise fades as results become predictable. You learn to trust what works instead of chasing novelty. Doubt still appears, usually late at night when the gym is empty and the noise of the day has settled. You wonder if narrowing focus limits growth, if saying no closes doors. Then you look at the numbers again. Conversion rises. Attendance steadies. Revenue moves with less volatility. The answers are already there. The gym feels lighter to run. Not because there's less work, but because the work compounds instead of resetting each week. Staff begin taking ownership, not because they're told to, but because the structure supports it. Expectations are clear. Wins are visible. Feedback lands without defensiveness. One afternoon, a member thanks you without making it a moment. They say the program makes consistency easier. They say they don't have to think as much. They just show up and follow the plan. You nod, knowing that this simplicity wasn't accidental. It was built, decision by decision, with clarity chosen over comfort. As the day winds down, you catch your reflection in the mirror, not while coaching or lifting, but while resetting the room for tomorrow. There's a quiet steadiness there now. Not pride, exactly, but confidence. The sense that the business is no longer fragile. It has a shape. It knows what it is. And once something has a shape, it becomes much harder to lose. The week moves forward in repetitions that no longer feel redundant. Each day echoes the one before it, not in monotony, but in reinforcement. The same questions surface. The same explanations are given. The same structure holds. Over time, this repetition produces something rare in small businesses. Reliability. You notice it first in yourself. You stop bracing before consultations. You stop rehearsing different versions of the same conversation. The process carries the weight now. You step into it. Ask. Listen. Present. Wait. Decisions happen without tension filling the room. The waiting matters more than it used to. Silence once felt dangerous, like a gap that needed to be filled with reassurance or extra detail. Now it feels useful. People use it to check in with themselves. You can almost see the decision forming, not as a calculation, but as a quiet alignment between expectation and willingness. When they speak again, it's often with clarity. Operations tighten quietly behind the scenes. Roles become clearer, not to restrict people, but to free them from guessing. Coaches know what success looks like because it's been defined. Front desk staff know how to guide conversations because the path is already laid out. Accountability stops feeling personal and starts feeling structural. There's a moment, usually midweek, when the gym is full but calm. Everyone is working, but no one seems rushed. Transitions between classes flow without friction. Equipment returns to its place without reminders. This isn't discipline enforced from above. It's behavior shaped by environment. The system teaches simply by existing. Financial conversations lose their emotional charge. You review revenue without spikes of anxiety or bursts of relief. Instead, you see patterns. You know which weeks will be heavier and which will be lighter, and you understand why. Forecasting becomes possible, not because the future is certain, but because the present is stable. Stability changes how you think about growth. Expansion stops being a fantasy and becomes a question of capacity. Can this system serve more people without breaking? Can the offer maintain its integrity if volume increases? These are operational questions, not motivational ones, and that difference matters. You experiment carefully. Small adjustments. Clear tests. One variable at a time. Results speak quickly when the system is clean. You keep what works. You remove what doesn't without attachment. Members sense this shift even if they can't name it. They describe the gym as organized, professional, different. They recommend it without being asked, not because they're incentivized, but because recommending it feels safe. Their reputation travels with the referral, and the experience consistently supports it. Late one night, after cleaning up and locking the door, you realize the business no longer follows you home. It occupies a defined space in your mind instead of spilling everywhere. That space allows for thinking instead of worrying. For planning instead of reacting. This is where leverage begins to appear. Not in shortcuts or hacks, but in alignment. Marketing reflects operations. Operations reflect the offer. The offer reflects the outcome promised. Each part supports the others without constant correction. The gym still requires effort. Long days still exist. Unexpected problems still surface. But the effort feels invested rather than spent. You're no longer holding something up. You're guiding something forward. As the lights shut off and the room goes dark again, the quiet feels earned. Not because the work is finished, but because it's working. And that distinction changes everything. The pace holds through the weekend. Saturdays used to arrive with uncertainty, swinging between crowded bursts and long stretches of waiting. Now they unfold with intention. Appointments are spaced deliberately. Classes fill to capacity without spilling over. The day moves forward without surprises, and that predictability creates room to notice smaller things. You notice how new members mirror those who've been around longer. They rack weights without being asked. They check the schedule before asking questions. They treat sessions as commitments rather than suggestions. Culture, once something you hoped might emerge, now appears as a natural byproduct of structure. During a consultation, someone asks about a cheaper option. The question isn't defensive, just curious. You answer without shifting tone. You explain the path again, the expectations, the support. You don't negotiate. The decision settles naturally. When they agree, it feels clean. When they decline, it also feels clean. Nothing lingers after. This clarity carries into advertising. Messages simplify, not because they lose depth, but because they know exactly who they're for. You stop measuring success by volume and start measuring it by conversations that move forward. Fewer leads arrive, but more of them show up ready. Follow-up becomes respectful instead of persistent. You reach out with context rather than pressure. Sometimes the answer is still no, but it's a no that closes the loop instead of leaving it open. Energy stops leaking through unanswered maybes. The team absorbs this tone. Sales stops feeling like a role and starts feeling like service. Coaches understand how their work connects directly to the promise made up front. What's sold and what's delivered finally line up, and that alignment reduces friction everywhere. As weeks pass, capacity reveals itself. Certain class times fill consistently. Certain coaches draw more demand. Instead of guessing what to do next, the data points clearly. You add sessions where demand proves itself. You adjust schedules with confidence instead of hope. There's an unexpected side effect to this order. Creativity returns. Without constant firefighting, there's space to think. New ideas surface, not as reactions, but as extensions of what already works. You test them carefully, respecting the system that made them possible. One evening, you sit with a notebook after closing. Not to vent, not to brainstorm wildly, but to refine. Small improvements. Clear language. Slight adjustments to onboarding. The work feels precise rather than desperate. Each change has a reason. You think back to the earlier days, when growth felt like pushing a heavy object uphill, slipping backward as often as you moved forward. The contrast is sharp. Now the effort feels cumulative. Each week builds on the last. Progress compounds quietly. Members comment on consistency more than intensity. They say it feels easier to stay on track. They say they trust the process. These statements land differently now. They aren't compliments. They're confirmations that the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. As the weekend ends and the lights dim once more, the gym rests without fragility. It doesn't feel like it will unravel if you step away for a moment. It feels like it knows how to hold itself. That awareness brings a calm that didn't exist before. Not relief, exactly, but readiness. The sense that whatever comes next can be met without scrambling. And in that calm, the business reveals something important. Stability isn't the opposite of growth. It's the condition that allows growth to last. Monday arrives again, but it no longer carries the weight it once did. The start of the week feels like continuation rather than reset. The calendar is already shaped. Sessions are already placed. Conversations are already expected. Nothing needs to be rescued. Your attention has shifted from survival to refinement. Small inefficiencies stand out now because urgency no longer hides them. A pause in onboarding that could be smoother. A handoff between staff that could be cleaner. These aren't problems that threaten the business. They're signals that the system is strong enough to be improved. The intake process sharpens over time. Questions are phrased to reveal patterns instead of collecting details. You listen for readiness rather than excitement. Some people arrive motivated but unstable. Others are quiet but committed. The system favors the second group, not because they're easier, but because they stay. You become more aware of the cost of misalignment. A client who isn't ready consumes more energy than several who are. An expectation left undefined creates friction that no amount of coaching can fully remove. Saying no early becomes an act of care, for the business and for the person standing in front of you. Staff meetings change tone. They grow shorter. More precise. Instead of debating what should be happening, you review what is happening and adjust from there. Feedback becomes directional rather than emotional. People know where they stand because the system shows them. There's a quiet satisfaction in watching coaches grow inside this structure. Their confidence increases as ambiguity fades. They spend less time managing behavior and more time delivering outcomes. Their work becomes cleaner. Their energy lasts longer. Financial review days lose their edge. The numbers still matter, but they no longer dictate your mood. You see trends instead of verdicts. When something dips, you trace it back through the process without panic. There's always a reason. There's always a lever. One afternoon, a former lead walks back in. They didn't join months ago. Life got in the way. They say the message stayed with them. They say the clarity made it easier to return when the time was right. You realize then that not every no is a failure. Some are simply waiting for alignment. The gym's reputation grows quietly. Not through hype, but through consistency. People describe it as structured, serious, supportive. Those words travel well. They attract the right attention without being chased. As the day closes, you complete the same walkthrough you've done countless times before. Lights dimmed. Equipment reset. The room settles. There's nothing to brace against. Only continuity. This is the point many never reach. Not because it's complex, but because it requires patience. Structure before scale. Clarity before creativity. Systems before intensity. The business is no longer asking to be saved. It's asking to be respected. And respecting it means staying disciplined even when things are working. Time stretches differently once the business stops fighting itself. Weeks pass without sharp edges. Problems still appear, but they arrive with context instead of chaos. You meet them with curiosity rather than urgency, and that shift shortens how long they linger. The gym begins to show you its limits honestly. Not through burnout or missed payments, but through full classes and waiting lists. Demand presses gently against capacity. The pressure feels clean. It points directly to where attention is needed without forcing you to guess. You start thinking in containers. How many people this system can serve well? What breaks first when volume increases? Where quality depends on presence rather than process. These questions guide decisions more reliably than ambition ever did. Expansion stops feeling like a leap and starts feeling like a calculation. You consider adding staff not because you're overwhelmed, but because the system can support them. Training becomes standardized. Expectations are documented. New hires step into clarity instead of confusion. There's a noticeable change in how you introduce the gym to outsiders. You no longer pitch. You explain. The difference is subtle but powerful. A pitch tries to persuade. An explanation assumes relevance and allows the listener to decide. That confidence carries its own weight. Marketing reflects this maturity. Campaigns become fewer and more deliberate. Offers aren't reinvented every month. They're refined. Language tightens. Visuals align. The message stays consistent long enough to be recognized. Members respond by staying longer. Their goals stretch beyond quick wins into longer horizons. Conversations shift toward sustainability. The gym becomes a place of continuity in their lives rather than a temporary phase. You feel this continuity personally as well. Your relationship with the business softens. It no longer demands constant reassurance. It no longer feels fragile. You can leave for a day without checking messages every hour. You can think beyond next week without guilt. One evening, during a quiet stretch, you revisit early notes you once kept. Scribbled ideas. Half-formed plans. Urgent adjustments. They feel distant now, not because they were wrong, but because they belong to a different stage. The discipline that created this stability remains mostly unseen. People notice the outcome, not the repetition. They see the calm, not the decisions that protected it. That's fine. The work was never meant to impress. It was meant to endure. As the lights dim again and the room settles into stillness, there's no sense of arrival. Only continuation. The system holds. People trust it. The business moves forward without noise. And that quiet forward motion becomes the clearest signal that it will last. There's a different quality to the mornings now. The door opens the same way, the lights rise to the same halfway point, but your attention no longer scans for trouble. It settles instead on detail. A slight delay that ripples outward. A missed note during onboarding that turns into a question weeks later. These things stand out because everything else is steady enough to reveal them. You start treating the business less like a machine and more like a living system. When something feels off, you trace it patiently. You look for where the signal first appeared instead of reacting to where it finally surfaced. You resist the urge to overcorrect. Often, a small adjustment restores balance completely. Clients feel this restraint even if they can't name it. They aren't overwhelmed by constant changes. The program stays recognizable. Progress feels cumulative. People settle into the work instead of bracing for the next shift. Trust deepens through familiarity, not novelty. The language of the gym grows quieter and more precise. Promises are made carefully. Expectations are repeated calmly. When issues arise, they're addressed without defensiveness. This tone sets a standard that carries through every interaction, shaping behavior without needing to enforce it. You watch new members absorb it. They arrive unsure, tentative in their movements, and gradually relax into confidence. Not because they're pushed, but because the environment holds them. They stop asking whether they're doing enough and start asking how to do better. That shift marks the line between compliance and commitment. There's a moment during a check-in when someone reflects on how long they've stayed consistent. They sound surprised by themselves. You recognize the feeling. Consistency becomes easier when decisions have already been made. The system removes friction before willpower ever needs to step in. Growth continues, but it doesn't announce itself. Revenue increases feel expected rather than dramatic. Referrals arrive without urgency attached. Each step forward feels earned instead of lucky. You stop explaining why things are working and simply observe that they are. At times, the impulse to accelerate surfaces. To push harder. To capitalize more aggressively. The thought passes. You remember what happens when pressure outruns structure. You choose restraint again, not from fear, but from respect for what has been built. As the day closes, you walk the floor once more. The room carries the quiet confidence of repetition done well. Nothing flashy. Nothing brittle. Just a system moving people forward at a pace they can sustain. And in that steadiness, something becomes clear. This is no longer about launches or momentum. It's about stewardship. About maintaining clarity long enough for results to become ordinary. The calendar turns without ceremony. No milestone announces itself. No line is crossed. The work continues, and in that continuation, progress becomes visible in quieter ways. What once felt fragile now feels habitual, and habits, when they're built well, carry weight without demanding attention. You begin to see how early decisions shaped everything that followed. Choosing a single clear path. Refusing to dilute the message. Repeating what worked long enough for it to take hold. Those decisions no longer feel active. They feel embedded, like grooves worn into the floor by years of consistent movement. New challenges still arrive, but they show up at a different altitude. You're no longer negotiating survival. You're deciding how well the business serves. Questions become more precise. How much personal attention is necessary? Where automation supports connection and where it quietly erodes it? Which standards can evolve and which must remain untouched? Misalignment reveals itself quickly now. A new hire who resists structure stands out almost immediately. A marketing message that drifts from the core promise feels uncomfortable before it ever performs poorly. Sensitivity increases as noise decreases, and that sensitivity becomes an advantage. You correct small deviations early, without drama. The system stays clean because it's maintained, not because it's perfect. Maintenance turns out to be quiet work. Repetitive. Mostly invisible. Effective. Clients respond to this consistency. They respect boundaries because boundaries don't move. They trust guidance because it doesn't change arbitrarily. The relationship between effort and outcome feels fair, and fairness sustains motivation longer than excitement ever could. You think back, occasionally, to the beginning. Back then, every win felt temporary, every setback felt personal. Now, wins feel expected, and setbacks feel informational. Emotional swings flatten into something steadier. Direction replaces adrenaline. There's room to think beyond the gym itself. Not in the sense of leaving, but extending. Teaching the system. Sharing the structure. Allowing what's been built here to live elsewhere without losing its shape. The idea sits quietly, waiting for timing to align with readiness. You don't rush it. You've learned that timing matters as much as intention. Moving too early can undo what patience built. As the lights dim and the room settles again, the most valuable outcome becomes clear. It was never just growth or revenue. It was the removal of chaos. The replacement of guessing with knowing. The ability to move forward without friction, constantly asking for attention. The gym rests, not because it's finished, but because it's aligned. And alignment, once established, carries itself forward longer than any surge of effort ever could. The days stop arriving labeled as good or bad. They simply begin, unfold, and end with a consistency that once felt unreachable. You notice this most in how little energy is spent deciding what to do next. The path is already defined. The work is already known. You step into it without negotiation. One morning, a new staff member stands quietly off to the side, watching. They notice how conversations start and how they end. How little is improvised. How rarely anyone rushes. Later, they say the place feels calm, almost understated. You understand what they mean. Calm isn't the absence of effort. It's what remains after effort has been organized. Training them is straightforward. You don't hand over motivation. You hand over sequence. What happens first? What happens next? What never changes? They settle in faster than you expected. Structure shortens the learning curve in ways enthusiasm never could. Clients continue to arrive through familiar channels. Some are referred. Some respond to messages that haven't changed in months. The words still work because they still reflect reality. You've learned that honesty doesn't expire the way trends do. There's a conversation with a long-term member who remembers the early days. They talk about how chaotic it once felt, how schedules shifted and offers changed. They laugh about it now, kindly. You hear the distance in their voice. The chaos no longer defines the place, even in memory. Financial decisions grow quieter. You invest deliberately. You save without tension. There's no urge to spend simply to feel movement. Momentum is already present. It doesn't need to be proved. Occasionally, something fails. A system breaks. A coach leaves with little notice. These moments don't spiral. You respond, adjust, and continue. Resilience shows itself not in resistance, but in how quickly things return to form. At the end of the week, you notice yourself leaving on time. Not rushing. Not escaping. Simply closing the door when the work is done. The gym holds its shape without you hovering nearby. That trust feels earned. This is where the work settles. Not into completion, but into care. You're no longer trying to show that it works. You're protecting the conditions that allow it to keep working. And that protection becomes the quiet promise that it will continue. The cycle closes without asking for acknowledgement. Another set of weeks passes. Another group begins, struggles, adapts, and stays. The pattern repeats, not mechanically, but faithfully. Each repetition reinforces the same understanding, one that no longer needs to be spoken. The business is no longer driven by bursts of intensity. It's held together by agreement. Agreement between what's promised and what's delivered. Between effort and outcome. Between the pace people can sustain and the results they're willing to earn. That agreement removes friction before it ever has the chance to appear. You feel this most clearly when you speak less. Explanations shorten. Guidance becomes reminders instead of instruction. The system does the teaching now. Your role is simply to maintain it. There's a quiet confidence in watching others succeed without your constant presence. Coaches handle conversations cleanly. Members support one another without prompting. The environment corrects small deviations on its own. This isn't control. It's alignment doing its work. Looking back, the urgency of the early days feels distant. Not mistaken, just unfinished. It was energy without direction, movement without sequence. What replaced it wasn't brilliance or luck. It was restraint. The choice to slow down long enough to build something repeatable. The idea of a launch has changed meaning. It's no longer a spike or an event. It's a doorway. A deliberate entry into a structure that already knows how to hold people. Success depends less on excitement and more on integrity. You take one last walk across the floor as the day ends. The lights are familiar. The equipment rests where it belongs. The quiet hum fills the room. Everything feels known, and that familiarity carries strength rather than stagnation. The gym stands as proof of something simple and difficult. When clarity leads, growth follows without being chased. When structure comes first, freedom arrives later. When chaos is removed, effort finally compounds. The door locks. The lights go out. The system rests, ready to repeat what it already knows how to do.